What's happening, everybody? Welcome inside a brand new edition of the Tall Can Audio Podcast for your Friday. Matt Robinson along with you as always. Hope you've had a fantastic week. We're all looking forward to a good weekend. Really looking forward to a conversation today with a guy named Oren Weisfeld. And look, if you follow basketball, you know the name, especially in this country. These guys written for Raptors Republic and Yahoo and Sportsnet. He knows what's up. And now he has a brand new book. It's called The Golden Generation, How Canada Became a Basketball Powerhouse. I just took it down here over the last several days. Really enjoyed it, to be honest with you. You guys know I'm not necessarily, basketball is not at the top of the list of my sports, but certainly when big things are going on, I like to jump in, follow the playoffs. If the Raptors are any good, follow them. And we talked quite a bit on this show throughout 2023 and 2024 in the summers about all the noise the national team on the men's side had begun to make after a long time out in the wilderness. So looking forward to having that conversation with Oren as the book covers all of it. As far as the pint goes today, we will be enjoying, this is a collaboration. I think I had it a couple of weeks ago on the show. I'm still sort of clearing out those Halloween beers, but I could be wrong. This is called the Goblin's Trill 8% double IPA called, like I said, Goblin's Trill. It is a collaboration between Blood Brothers and Bellwoods, and both of those breweries make fantastic stuff. So I know I've had this once before. I just can't remember whether it was on the show or not. I know it's a good beer. That's what we'll be riding with while we talk to Oren today. And man, for something at 8% that kind of can sometimes come off a little boozy, this holds a little bit of that IPA crispness to it. I like that a lot. It's just tough, right? The more you ramp up that alcohol percentage, it starts to get boozy, or sometimes that can get hidden in a hazy IPA or something. But to keep that IPA bite to it, I like that, and this does a nice job. But with that done, we might as well get right into it here. Let's not wait any longer. We're talking to Oren Weisfeld about his new book, The Golden Generation, How Canada Became a Basketball Powerhouse. As promised, I'm happy to have on the show today Oren Weisfeld, a guy who, look, if you follow basketball in this country, needs no introduction. He's written for Raptors Republic, Sportsnet, Yahoo. He's been all over the place, and now he's got a book. It's called The Golden Generation, How Canada Became a Basketball Powerhouse. Thanks for taking the time, Oren. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to get this book out into the world. Just came out a couple days ago officially, and so excited to hear about people like you who have already gone through it.
Yeah, honestly, pretty easy read. I've said to a couple of our listeners before, and my co-hosts know, like, I'm not necessarily the most knowledgeable basketball guy in the world. I get on board when something big is happening, and it's certainly when a national team is wearing the flag in any sport, I'm all in. A handful of Raptors games here and there, but when they're good, I'm watching every playoff game. And one of the things that I thought was pretty cool about the book was it seemed to walk a pretty nice line between, look, if you know basketball really well, it seems like there'll be some interesting factoids in there and it will still speak to you. But you don't have to be an expert in basketball for this to still speak to you and tell a nice story and kind of arch the history of Canadian basketball. That can't be an easy line to walk, man, to try and make it approachable for everybody. Like, this might be a stocking stuffer or a Christmas gift kind of thing, but also wanting hardcore basketball fans to be able to get something out of it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it walked that line for you. I think that is the constant give and take, because on one hand, you're trying to get as much information in there as possible, and this definitely could have been a 500-page book. I didn't even include so many things. Even like the history of Quebec basketball was a cut, for example. It was a chapter I cut. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you also want it to be approachable and entertaining. And I especially had in mind like the next generation, like kids who are growing up wanting to be basketball players, following these guys like Shea and Andrew Nemhard and Jamal Murray. But, books are maybe intimidating, and I wanted to keep it a relatively entertaining and easy read for young people too, because I think it's important for them to know the history and kind of the shoulders that they stand on as well.
Well, I think you've done a nice job kind of walking that line. One of the things that was interesting to me in reading about getting through it is the format you chose to do it, or the structure that the book takes. And it includes player profiles, and not just players, other people who have been instrumental in Canadian basketball, but it's sort of interwoven chapter by chapter in the timeline of Canadian basketball. This is something when we have authors on the show, I like to ask them about is, how conscious you are, or when you sit down to tackle a project like this, how you decide on that kind of structure. I don't want to do just profiles. I don't want to do just timeline. I think I'd like to include both, and I wonder how I can weave them together. As you're sitting down and getting ready to write something like this, how big of a mountain does that appear to be to scale to do both, and how do you decide on this structure of being able to weave them together that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't got so I owe a lot of thanks to Dream Team, which is one of my favorite books by Jack McCullum, which traces kind of the 1992 American Dream Team. The first time American pros were allowed to play basketball at the Olympics, when Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley and Larry Bird and all these guys went. And his book is done in a similar format. His, I think, even sticks more to it in terms of like each chapter goes from a game or something that happened at the Olympics to a backstory and something that, that was formative in the life of Larry Bird or the life of Michael Jordan. So that was definitely an inspiration to me because it's one of my favorite sports books. Mm-hmm. The other side of it was like when I started the book, it was more of a Canada basketball book. That was how I originally pitched it. Learning about the history of the men's team and all that stuff. But as I got into it and as I started talking to people, I realized that it would kind of be doing a disservice to Canadian basketball to only tell that story, because really the growth happened at the grassroots level more so than, the national team gets these guys for maybe a month, a few weeks every summer. But it's really the coaches who are in the gym with them every day. It's the parents who are taking them to practice. It's those people that, deserve more of a spotlight. And so that's how the book ended up going in that direction. And so it was a lot of things. It was the national team. It was the backstories of players. It was the big developments that happened at the grassroots level. And I tried to weave all of those three elements together as best I could.
One of the things that really stands out and that you illustrate very well in the first few chapters of the book is this separation between what's happening kind of in central Canada, maybe Toronto or Hamilton or Montreal, and the national team itself, which seems to be, a lot of university kids and based that way, and it's out west. And there is certainly a racial, maybe undertone is understating it. Like that, it was certainly a factor in the early days of Canadian basketball. How much of that, in your opinion, was what was if I can rephrase the question, I suppose I've talked myself into a corner here. Like, how do you view the way that was playing out? Was it an ignorance? Was it an outright racism? We don't want many black players here. Was it more an ignorance? We don't know what's happening in other parts of the country. Like, it's certainly a big part of the early days of Canadian basketball, and it seems like it took quite a while for there to be any sort of trust between the two communities and to a place where they could coexist.
Yeah, so I'll go back a bit. Like the nexus of basketball power in Canada was always in the West Coast, was always in BC. And the national team always structured their training camps out of BC. A lot of the players ended up being youth sports players from that area who had a, natural kind of fit on the national team because the coaches played that style or whatever it might have been. But what happened after like immigration really kicked off in the 70s was all these West Indian migrants came to Toronto and Montreal, and they started going from those high schools to the NCAA, and they started to have a ton of success. They started leading Team Ontario to gold medal every single year. So there was this tension, like how come those guys aren't represented on the national team? Mm-hmm. What I learned in the research was that there was a lot of factors. It was the executives, it was the coaches. There was an element of ignorance for sure in that the type of basketball that they played didn't really represent what was happening in Toronto, where a lot of kids learned the game outside at the parks. It was fast. It was played above the rim. It was super athletic. And that's not how the national team played. Back then it was super structured. It was old school. It was, a double big offense and a bunch of guys cutting meticulously around them. And it took a lot of time for those two things to catch up. What I learned after talking to maybe 15 black players on the record was, I did feel comfortable calling it systemic racism. I called it, black players had to work twice as hard to get half as far on the national team. And I felt comfortable saying that because I talked to so many players who, yes, there was subtle stuff going on, but there was also explicit racism as well, where coaches were being, where players and coaches were doing stuff that I say in the book
Yeah.
that just comes across as explicitly racist as well. So, I'd also get into how that lingered and that disconnect between the grassroots community in Toronto and Montreal and the national team. It really didn't fix itself until the last few years. And even now there's some tension lingering. But if you talk to Leo Reutens, who coached the team from 2005 to 2011, he had to go into the community and try to explain that this is going to be different, that things were going to be run different. And all the guys that we know today in the NBA, like their parents, their uncles, their dads grew up with the notion that the national team was either racist or that it was a poorly run organization, So it took a very long time to get over that.
We sort of, started towards what my next question was going to be, and that is the state of things now. And look, you look around the national team right now, and there are certainly the black community is well represented. And you do outline in the book the efforts that were made and some staffing changes and coaching changes to try to fix this. What is the state of things now? And is the tension based on the past and lingering resentment, or are there still issues around the national team as it pertains to race?
No, I don't think there's any more issues as it pertains to race. Not only are the coaches and players well represented, but the general manager is a black guy, is a guy who spoke to me on the book about some of those issues that he grew up dealing with in Rowan Barrett. So I don't think race is any longer a problem. There will always be tension between the grassroots community and the federal organization. That's probably exists to some extent in any sport, but definitely the history plays an outsized part in basketball.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of where the organization is at now, I don't think it's race anymore. I think the problems that exist probably have more to do with people feeling like they don't get their players don't get a fair shot, or that there's politics here and there and different kind of stuff.
Sure. You sort of outlined in some of the chapters here that, the funding that basketball would receive in Canada was, sort of similar to other team sports in Canada, but that we don't have a strong history of funding amateur sports that are team sports. It often goes towards singular sports. I'm sort of curious how that growth has come. Is it better represented now? Basketball is certainly more popular in Canada than it used to be. The Raptors, I'm certain, have helped that. The star power on the national team now has helped that. Are they still as reliant on funding from the federal government, or has sponsorship gotten to a place now where, these guys are treated a lot more like they should have always been?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. I mean, Canada Basketball has done a really good job about going out and getting corporate sponsorship. Obviously, those sponsors historically weren't putting their money into basketball because it wasn't a safe bet like hockey was.
Mm-hmm.
Now they see the potential and they're late to the party, but that's great. I mean, however, the federal government still really lags behind when it comes to funding sport. The new Carney budget just came out, and he didn't provide any more money to sport, which all of the organizations are super frustrated about, because Canada's falling way behind the eight ball when it comes to international sport. And as an example, in basketball, I mean, Canada Basketball makes about half as much as Hockey Canada gets in a given year from the federal government. And the basketball team is outspent by about 6 times by France and USA.
Wow.
So that gives you an example of the kind of how far behind they're playing for when they go to these international competitions, in terms of where they have their training camps, where they stay, all of these competitive advantages.
Well, you referenced in the most recent Olympics that, the Americans and the French are staying in these beautiful hotels or resorts and places, and Canada's, in these dorms where, I know a lot of athletes, and, whether you mention hockey or whatever else, to talk about how much fun it is to be in an Olympic village. These guys are 6'10" or whatever. Like the little beds that they're being put in these dorms are just not suitable for high performance sport at that level.
Yeah, so they were upset. Like when the players got to the Olympics, they were upset, and the reason was they weren't really in the Olympic Village. There was a small village set up just for the basketball team, which was in Lille, a couple hours from Paris. And France, they stayed in like this nice facility in the countryside. Team USA stayed at a 5-star hotel in Paris and just took the train into the games. But Canada didn't have the money for that,
Right.
so that's why they were staying in those dorm rooms in Lille. So yeah, things are a lot better than they ever were, and the players are treated well. They charter flights, they have better training camps, they have great coaching. So it's not to say that like these guys are struggling by any means, but in terms of the federal government, they could certainly do more to help not just Canada basketball, but all these all these provincial and federal sports organizations. Because one thing that they're warning about right now is that we're going to see at the Winter Olympics in 26, like there could be a sharp drop off of medals from what we're used to from Canada, and that's directly correlated to the lack of funds.
I wasn't aware that prediction had landed. That will not land well in as we're sitting down to watch these things. And I'm curious, the timing of the book as you began to put it together and how long you had this vision. Just based on my knowledge of how long it takes to write a book, it has to have predated this last rise or spurt that has come, but it does seem to have synced up nicely with the 2023 World Cup performance that got them into the Olympics. And look, Canada doesn't win a medal in 24 in Paris, but all your top guys are there and showing up, and they are competitive, and they have a great round robin. Is that just, luck, or is it that rise that kind of spurs you on to do the book? How does the timeline sync up?
Yeah, so I'll take you back a bit. Like, I started covering the Raptors in 2018, and I would go to games and cover the NBA and the Raptors, and it was a super saturated market, and I kind of saw each year there was more and more Canadians getting to the NBA. So that's when I kind of made the shift to cover more Canadians, whether they were like in high school or in NCAA or pro overseas. I wanted to kind of focus my attention on that because they weren't getting the spotlight that I thought they deserved. I had the idea that, hey, maybe a book could happen if Canada ever gets back to the Olympics, but it actually wasn't until they beat Spain in 2023 and they clinched their spot in the Olympics with Shea having a monster performance, Dylan Brooks. That's when I knew, like, okay, there's a book here. And obviously I hoped, like, in 24 they'll win a medal and that'll do even better. But I would say it's definitely a combination of luck with, like, in the finals last year, there was 4 Canadians starting some of the games. So that was lucky, and I couldn't have predicted Shea to have the season he had last year. But at the same time, I saw where this was going, and I saw guys were committing to the national team because like they were in safer spots with their contracts and all that stuff in the NBA. And I saw just the rise of talent making it into the all-star MVP conversations. And the timing, I think, worked well, and if they do ever medal in 2028, then we'll need a new edition of the book.
One of the things that this run that Canada basketball has been on, and I guess it predates the run as well, is like in my head it stands out, and I'm not going to pretend to be a knowledgeable soccer fan either. As I've said, when national teams roll out, they have my attention, but I don't know who's playing in the EPL and who's playing in La Liga and whatever else is going on in Europe. And I remember, there's a chapter in your book about Mexico City and how they sort of fell flat there. And then the qualifier in Victoria, which had a bunch of names show up, and it still didn't quite pan out, and there was all these false starts. And it reminded me a little of the times I'd try and get really invested in the men's soccer team, and they'd go down to Honduras and get just humbled in this horrible kind of embarrassing way. And I was sure, like, as much as that's turning me off as someone trying to get into the sport, it's got to be turning off guys who want to come and play. And now, sort of along the same timeline that the Canadian men's basketball team was sort of starting to put it together and committing to each other and getting on this run at the World Cup and the Olympics, you saw the men's soccer team, building momentum through qualification and finally getting to a World Cup. And now they're going to host World Cup games. I'm sort of curious whether for you that timeline is similar, all these false starts and finally starting to gather some success, and what the... if that is correct and there is momentum now and they are building in that direction, what the ceiling is for national team viewership. Like, how big can this get where, we just watched all these numbers get released for the Jays in the World Series. Canadians will rally around something if it feels like Canada's team. What is the ceiling for international basketball in this country?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways I could go with that. I saw this picture, I will bring it back to the race angle real quick, but
Sure.
I saw this picture of the Canada soccer team back 30 years ago or whatever, and it was all white
Yeah,
players, and obviously it went viral on social media. I'm not sure if you remember that,
I
but
do. Yeah.
I had a very similar reaction knowing what I knew about the Canada basketball program. I have a feeling Soccer Canada was run in a similar way, and whenever that happens, it takes a long, long time to get out from in front of yourself and make the program successful when you have so much I guess just getting in the way of yourself and you ruin the reputation of the program. Of course there's going to be some false starts when you're finally trying to do things the right way. It doesn't just magically happen that okay, you're starting to get some money, you're starting to get some better people running things, and now you're going to win international competitions, because every other nation is also pouring all their hearts
Mhm.
into this and trying to win. So there are definitely parallels between the two, and I think now that our best players are represented in each sport, no matter where they come from or what they look like, that certainly helps them have success. And in terms of the impact they can have, I mean, hockey has always been the sport that kind of was synonymous with Canadian identity, and you know, participation numbers are down in that sport. Meanwhile, soccer and basketball are the most played youth sports because we have, new Canadians
Yep.
who find more appeal in those sports, find it more accessible. Obviously, the culture of hockey isn't always the most easy
Hmm.
to insert yourself in. And meanwhile, the Canadian hockey team is still dominant, but it's no longer a given that they're going to win gold at every tournament. So we'll see what happens at the Olympics here, but there are kind of going on two different trajectories, right? Where
Sure.
hockey is maybe the rest of the world is catching up a little bit, and with soccer and basketball, we are catching up to the rest of the world. So if they do ever win a medal, whether it's a FIFA World Cup or an Olympic Games, yeah, I could see it being similar to what happened when the Raptors won a championship, where it just ignites a new generation to kind of pick up the sport.
It's funny you go there because, again, that was going to be sort of my next question. We all talk, about the impact that Vince Carter had in the dunk contest and the Raptors arriving and then becoming relevant and all of that, coming in waves a little bit, whether it be the arrival of the team and then the arrival of Vince. And if you fast forward a little bit, the championship. I'm curious, in all the interviews you did, I believe it says in the book that you spoke to over 100 people. Is that as big to those people as we sort of as fans assume it was, that was kind of the launch point, then that was where the match was lit? Or did people you spoke to have a different take on what it was that sort of caused us to arrive at this place now where there's more Canadians in the NBA than there's ever been?
So I think there's two things here, and this is something I had to learn too, is there's inspiration and then there's infrastructure. Carter was super inspiring, and all the guys that I talked to, Andrew Wiggins was born in 1995, the same year the Raptors came into existence. So of course he grew up watching the Raptors on TV. Of course that played a huge influence in, believing that he could make it, and also seeing what he wanted to do when he was older. I think that was huge for this generation, just being able to see a guy in Vince who looked like them and who was super cool and who was super popular, playing for their city, putting it on the map. That was inspiring for a lot of guys to take up the sport. However, we didn't have the infrastructure to send those guys to the pros, to develop them, to showcase them to NCAA schools, and then to create a support system where they were then able to reach the highest level of the sport. So those two things kind of happened simultaneously. I have a quote in there from Rob Wright, who is the director of Ontario basketball at the time, who said, people are going to tell you that Vince was the starting off point, but at the same time, Ontario basketball was building a machine. And it's true, Ontario basketball was seeing their participation rise by 10% each year preceding the Raptors. So, they were already building an infrastructure. And at the same time, guys like Vince were inspiring people to play. And it was only after those two things happened together that Canada was actually able to produce all these pros.
Last thing for you then on this, where do we go from here? I heard you speaking on a different show not too long ago, and you pointed out this idea of the local rink on Saturday morning. You get up and mom and dad and the grandparents go and they watch their kids play, and different generations are interacting and just speaking and having coffee and whatever else. And that chapter had sort of been missed in Canadian basketball. And maybe to circle back to the beginning of our conversation, the ignorance of not understanding what immigration was going to mean to this country and what new Canadians were going to be interested in. Is that where we go next, trying to create more community? Like, what can fans be doing to kind of push along the growth of the sport in this country? How do we kind of create those communities?
I think, again, like, hockey has always been so ubiquitous with Canadian identity, and it's starting to shift. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that shift is, again, what people did at the grassroots level in spite of the government, in spite of the corporate powers that be. I think the next step is really for those people to come on board, and it's to invest in basketball and to invest in women's basketball and women's sport. And it's to kind of be a little bit more imaginative in terms of like where your money can go and where your resources can go. Of course, hockey's always been the safe thing. But I think that failure to kind of see this coming and to see what basketball could mean for all these people has led to these funding problems and has led to these, lack of fans at times. So I think that's the next step, is to think about and imagine, like, what could these sports like soccer and basketball actually mean for Canada? How could they become a part of the Canadian identity so it's no longer just hockey?
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating question. I think, that is one of the things we can compare with soccer and people coming from other places and even just approachability and the financial aspects that go with it. And, it's been fascinating to watch. And I guess, it's something we're going to have to wait and see and see if people kind of get themselves wrapped up in the flag and watching this team become more competitive and be there long term. It was a fascinating read, man. And I know I sort of said that that was going to be my last question, but I'm curious, this international run, should we expect in 10 or 15 years that what we saw in 23 and the Olympics in Paris being, it wasn't the middle of the night like some Olympics are. Most of the games were easy to watch in the afternoon. Does that have the potential to create another boom like Vince did that we are more prepared for, that we will have a better infrastructure for?
I mean, unfortunately, I don't think so. I think that run was pretty relegated to the diehards just because Canada didn't go as far. People don't watch the World Cup in Canada, and then the Olympics, they didn't go as far as hoped. What I do think is going to happen is I think 2028 is really going to be the year. And it was always really, that was when all these guys were going to be in their prime. 24 was, if anything, going to be an early kind of introduction, and it didn't happen. But I think 2028, the team will be deeper at the front court. Shea, Andrew Nembhard, Jamal Murray, RJ Barrett, all these guys are going to be in their primes as opposed to like 24, 25 years old. And that, to me, is the tournament where they can really make a run. Meanwhile, Team USA has all these legends who are turning 40. So it opens up a real possibility for them to create a run that will be remembered by all the casual Canadian fans for a long, long time. So that's more what I anticipate. I don't think 23, 24 quite had that juice, but it's right now it's building. Shea won MVP. He won the championship. Lou Dort won, Benedict Mathurin and Andrew Nembhard were playing them in the finals. RJ Barrett is a Toronto Raptor. All these things are building towards what I think in 2028 could be a pretty special time.
The book is called The Golden Generation, How Canada Became a Basketball Powerhouse. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you think people should know or that you want to touch on or to promote here before we wrap things up?
No, I think we touched on a lot of it. I mean, yeah, you're going to learn a lot about the Trailblazers who kind of laid the groundwork for these guys, and you're also going to learn a lot about the players who we know today, whether it's Shea or Jamal Murray or RJ, and their backstories and where they come from. So I think, yeah, like you said at the beginning, it's pretty approachable for any kind of basketball fan. And just $25. You can get it at Indigo, Amazon, wherever you get your books. It's a good holiday gift. So yeah, appreciate all the support, and thanks for having me on.
It was great to talk to you. Like I said, a very enjoyable read, and we will, of course, link to the book in the show notes here on the website and wherever you're hearing us right now. Oren Weisfeld, thank you so much, man. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me anytime.
All right, fun conversation there, to be honest. And it's after we stopped recording, Oren did mention that he's battling a bit of a cold. You might have been able to tell. I feel bad for the guy. You know, you spend years putting a book like that together, all the effort that goes into it, and then you got 1,000 interviews to do. You got book launch events. You're shaking a bunch of hands, and he mentioned he's just a little bit run down. He got a cold sort of as he's working his way through the final stages of it. I don't think any of us would have trouble understanding why that is. Been a busy several weeks, several months, several years for Oren Weisfeld. That was fun, and honestly, I enjoyed the book. It was, like I said off the top, you guys know basketball isn't my top sport, but this speaks to any Canadian sports fan and how this organization got to where it is now, because it was not always like this. And I meant it when I compared it to the Canadian men's soccer team. How many times did it sort of feel like they were falling on their faces at different points that they were supposed to be taking off before they finally got on this really fun run and qualified for the last World Cup? It sort of feels similar to me to what this men's national team on the basketball side has begun to do. And Oren mentioned there that he never really expected 2024 to be the arrival moment, that was always going to be more likely to be 2028. But 2023 and 2024 were still pretty fun. So if we've got more of that out in front of us, that would be fantastic. And again, not dissimilar to the soccer thing. Both organizations have had more successful women's programs for a while, and then all of a sudden the men catch up, and look, maybe we're about to become a basketball powerhouse. And when you look at the talent, you know, he mentioned last year's NBA final having 4 Canadians in it. The talent is there, and I don't think Canada's ever going to overcome the United States, but you could easily become, you know, the number 2 power in the world with the amount of talent coming out of this country and the cultural similarities to the United States in a lot of regards. Look, there are powerhouses over in Europe and Spain and Serbia and some of these other, France certainly. But in terms of depth and numbers of guys in the NBA and that are playing in European leagues and can step into a national team situation, future looks bright in Canada. Really enjoyable read. As I've mentioned now a few times, the book is called The Golden Generation: How Canada Became a Basketball Powerhouse. We will link to it in the show notes at tallcanaudio.com or in whatever app you're hearing me right now. There's a link right there. If you use our link, you'll pay what you were always going to pay, but they'll kick a little money back our way for sending you there. So we'd appreciate it if you go ahead and do that if you're thinking about ordering this or any of the books that we've talked about recently over the last few weeks. James Duthie's been here. We talked Certified Beauties. Mark Hebscher's been here, talked about his book, Madness, The Rise and Ruin of Sports Media. Andy Petrillo was here with her newest memoir. Look, it's fun, and I have read a lot of books now. It's been 4 books in the last 3 or 4 weeks that I've had to power through to. And look, lots of people do these shows, and, you know, you skim the book or you just make sure you understand the topic at hand. I don't feel prepared for these podcasts, for these interviews, unless I've actually read the entire book and finished it. And sometimes it's just impossible, but you do your best to try and power through them as much as you can and be finished. And I just finished Oren's a couple hours before the interview here. So it was the last one on the calendar. As like I said, we just had 4 over the course of the last 3 weeks. That's a lot of reading. And honestly, feeling pretty lucky. We got contacted by a press person from ECW Press that mentioned Andy, Mark, and Oren's books here that we've talked about. The Certified Beauties, that just fell in our lap. I was trading a couple of messages on Twitter with Duthie, and he mentioned he was going to be in town, and he was happy to come in studio. But sometimes when it rains, it pours, and you do your best to get through them. So I don't know. Maybe for the next little while, a little TV or some podcasts or something. A little less reading here maybe over the next couple of weeks. Next week, though, we're looking forward to having Cheryl Pounder in studio She's been on the show a few times before. That's always been done remotely, but she's going to come into the TCA studio for the first time. You should look for that to drop on Thursday morning of next week. That's going to be a lot of fun. And other than that, we're sort of back on turn now, getting back to normal here after Blue Jays playoff run kind of had us off kilter a little bit. So hope you all have a fantastic weekend. We'll be looking forward to talking to you all again next week. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Matt Robinson. We'll talk to you later.
That's it. I cannot work under these conditions. If anybody wants me, I'll be downstairs at McDougal's. Call the weekend guy. I don't care.